Good morning and welcome to Godly Play on this last Sunday in May. Welcome. We're glad that you've come to the circle. Find your spot. Get comfortable. As always, I'm wondering who you've got with you today. I'm wondering if maybe your parents or maybe your brother or sister or someone else. Well, everyone's welcome. So, time to get ready. Getting our bodies ready, our eyes ready, our ears, and our hearts. Once there was someone who said such wonderful things and did such amazing things that people began to follow him. And as they followed him, they wondered who he was, who he really was. And they just couldn't help themselves. They had to ask him. And one of the times when they asked him who he was, he said, "I am the light." Let's enjoy the light. I see the love of God in you, the light of Christ comes shining through, and I am blessed to be with you, O holy child of God. And you know that this light didn't stay in that one place in that one time, because he changed the light so it can be in all times and in all places. So watch as I change the light. You may be able to see it. I don't know. There it goes. Filling the room. And coming to where you are, so that wherever we go in Godly Play today, this light will be with us. And when we leave, the light will go with us too. You ready for a story? Well, today we have our calendar from the Godly Playroom, and I want to thank Janice because she went and got it and brought it to me, so it's easier for you to see. And I wanted to show you this because today something happens. We remember this is the mystery of Christmas and the mystery of Easter, and then these 6 Sundays to remember this great mystery of Easter. And now this week we move on to this red one. Oh, it's hot. So our story today is found in the book of Acts, which is the book that comes after the Gospels and was written by Luke. And this is chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. So afterwards you may want to check this out and read it in your Bible too. I hope you do. So, this is the last week of knowing Jesus in a new way. So there's a lot of story to tell. Are you ready? And get settled? Okay, I think I'm ready too. Here we go. So on the first Sunday, Easter Sunday, it was the women who were going to the tomb, and they were carrying spices, if you remember, to finish the burial, and they were wondering how they would move the stone, but they just wanted to be close to where Jesus was. But to their surprise, when they got there, the stone was rolled away, and when they looked in, all that was there was the white linen cloth that had covered the body. Well, they ran back to tell the other disciples, and as you remember, they were not believed. well, except Peter and then John, who jumped up and ran to the tomb to see for themselves. And when they looked in, they could feel Jesus' presence in his absence. But he was gone, truly gone. So they rushed back to tell the other disciples. And you remember that it was Mary Magdalene who stood there by the entry to the tomb weeping, and how she heard, "Woman, why are you weeping?" and looked to see that two men in shining raiment were there, and asked her, why did she seek the living among the dead? And that how Mary lingered there, and she heard another voice, "Woman, why do you weep?" And this time she turned, thinking he was the gardener, and asking him if he knew where they took the body. And the person said, "Mary." And by calling her name, she knew who he was. She must have stepped towards him, because he said, "No, not now. I've risen, but not yet ascended to my Father." And then he was gone. And Mary ran back to tell the rest. And then you remember how on that same afternoon, two of the followers of Jesus were walking away from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And as they were walking and wondering about all the things that had happened, the cross, the empty tomb, how a stranger came and walked with them and wanted to know what they were talking about, and how he opened the scriptures to them. And you remember that when they got to Emmaus, they invited the stranger in to have dinner with them. And at the table, the stranger took bread, gave thanks to God, and broke it. And in that moment, they knew it was he. And then he was gone. And they said to themselves, "Did not our hearts burn within us as he was opening the scriptures to us?" And then they went back to Jerusalem to tell the others. And then we remember how the disciples were gathered in a room with the doors closed because they were afraid the soldiers might come and get them, just as they had Jesus. And then in the midst, they heard, "Peace be with you." And they looked, and it was he. At first they thought it was a ghost, and how they were a little afraid, and how Jesus then showed him his wounds and ate some fish, and how he opened the scriptures to them the way he had to the others on the road to Emmaus. And you remember that Thomas wasn't there at that time. And so when the disciples told him about what had happened, Thomas said, "I don't believe. I'm not going to believe till I can put my fingers in his wounds." Thomas had doubt in his bones, but that was not surprising. Everybody's minds were stretching to know Jesus in this new way. And then you remember how the next time, 8 days later, when they were again gathered in that room, and they heard, "Peace be with you." This time Thomas was with them, and how Jesus walked right up to him and said, "Thomas, put your hands in my wounds." And how Thomas dropped to the floor and said, "My Lord and my God." And how Jesus said, "Have you believed only because you've seen?" And how he said to the other disciples, "Blessed are those who have not yet seen, but will believe." And then you remember how the disciples went up to Galilee, as they'd been told, and waited for Jesus. And while they were waiting, you remember they went fishing, and they fished all night. It felt comfortable, like home. This is something they'd done as boys. And how in the morning they still hadn't caught any fish, but they did see someone on the shore with a charcoal fire who asked them if they'd caught anything. And you remember that they said, "No, we haven't caught anything at all." And how he told them to throw the net over on the other side. And how they did, and how they could feel the fish moving and filling the net so full they couldn't even pull the net on board. And you remember how John, who wasn't paying attention at all to the fish, said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And how Peter jumped into the water and swam and waded to the shore. And how the rest of the disciples brought the boat in. You remember that Jesus fed them breakfast. And then you remember he asked Peter if he loved him. "Peter, do you love me?" 3 times. And each time Peter said, Lord, you know that I do. And each time Jesus said, feed my sheep, my lambs, tend my sheep. And how they walked a little bit on the shore because Jesus had been talking to Peter about becoming old. Maybe others thought that he was getting Peter ready for his death as an old man in Rome, and how Peter looked back and saw John a little while behind them and asked Jesus, is this man also going to die like the rest of us? And how Jesus said, it is not for you to know these things. And then Jesus was gone. And then you remember how they went up to the mountain to meet him. And they were getting used to knowing Jesus in this new way. And they started asking him questions. And then Jesus said something, all dominion has been given unto me in heaven and on earth. And they didn't understand what he was talking about. And then he said something they did understand. And you remember, it was not what they wanted to hear. Go everywhere. Tell my story to everyone, even this part. Show people how to be good disciples. This was too much to do, too far to travel. The disciples were full of fear and anxiety. Jesus told them that he would send the Holy Spirit to help them, and then he was gone. And as they were walking back to Jerusalem, you remember that they realized that they were no longer sheep, but were going to be shepherds, no longer followers, but they needed to be leaders. And then last week, you remember how they met in a room in Jerusalem, and how Jesus once again came to them, and they were getting comfortable. They asked him some questions, and Jesus then took them out into the street through Jerusalem and out to the Mount of Olives, which was near Bethany, and how the disciples gathered around him, and how Jesus put up his hands, and then he withdrew, and a cloud took him out of sight. And how they were all standing there staring up at the sky when two men dressed in dazzling white raiment asked them, what are you looking at? This Jesus is gone as you've known him. They realized they felt rather foolish looking up. And as they walked back towards Jerusalem, they wondered about this Holy Spirit. What would it look like? How would they know when it came? They went and they waited. And then this week, it was Pentecost, which is Shavuot in the Hebrew. And it was springtime, so a time of greening and blooming in the fields. The grain was ripe, and the streets of Jerusalem were filled with people from all over the Roman Empire who'd come to celebrate in the temple, remembering the legendary 50 days between Passover and the time that God gave Moses the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. The disciples were there too, but they were again in a room together, and some say it was even the very room where they had shared the Last Supper with Jesus. And they sat quietly and prayed. And as they did, there was a sound of a great wind, and it swept through the house and shook everyone. And bits of flame came and danced around them, each one. It felt like they were on fire. They were so filled with joy that they ran out to the streets and started talking and telling everyone. Some of the people said, "You must be drunk." And yet everyone could understand what the disciples were saying, no matter what language they spoke. Then Peter walked into the chaos with a calm and confidence the disciples had never seen before. And he said, "These men are not drunk. It is only early morning. I'll tell you what's happened. You remember the prophet Joel prophesied that God would send God's Spirit down on his sons and daughters, and that they would be filled with the Holy Spirit, and that the young will see visions, and the old will dream dreams, and that they will prophesy. This is what has happened. Well, some of the people just carried on their way towards the temple, keeping their great traditions and leading good lives. But some turned, listened, and were baptized and filled with the Holy Spirit. And that is why the color of Pentecost is red. Red for fire and red for great joy. And somewhere, the Holy Spirit that came down like a dove at Jesus' baptism must have been smiling. This was not a baptism by water, but a baptism by fire. And now the color changes. "50 days and so many stories. I wonder which one you like best." I wonder which one's about you, where you are in this story. I wonder where people that you're with are in this story. I'm wondering if anyone has touched the fire of the Holy Spirit in Pentecost. I wonder. So our time with this story is over, but you can watch it again as many times as you want, because this story is for you. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Next week, Janice is telling the story. See you then.